Labadiena, gerbimi šios transliacijos dalyviai, verslo partneriai, mėly kolegos. Netrukus pratęsiu renginio pristatymą lietuvių kalba, bet kartu noriu pasisveikinti ir su mūsų angliakalbiais videokonferencijos dalyviais. So, good afternoon, dear participants and business partners. This event will be held in 2 languages and considering our dear local client request that local speakers will do their presentation in Lithuanian language, while our dear guest speakers from other countries, of course, will do it in English. So I apologize for any inconvenience if that may create to you. But I will now continue in Lithuanian and we will switch back to English with second presentation on our agenda. Taigi vėl persijungiu į lietuvių kalbą ir pirmiausiai noriu prisistatyti. Tai mano vardas Vilius Juzikis, esu SEB banko valdybos narys, atsakingas už verslo bankininkystės tarnybą. Ir šiandien nuoširdžiai džiaugiuosi galėdamas jūs pakviesti į šios dienos SEB banko organizuojamą videokonferenciją, kurioje diskutuosime ir dalinsimės įžvalgomis bei geriausia patirtimi apie tvarų verslą. Tema, kurios turbūt visi nebejojame, kad aktualumas auga eksponentiškai ir tikrai turbūt nebe pagrindo. Nes tvarus verslo modelis tampa tiesiog jau svarbiu konkurenciniu pranašumu. Mes kartu matome vis stiprėjančią Europos Sąjungos poziciją ir tikrai didelį ryžtą mažinti aplinkai daromą žalą, taip pat skirti tam didelės investicijas, didelį finansavimą. Tad ir šios Vaizdo konferencijos metu tiek banko atstovai, tiek ir mūsų pakviesti gerbiami tvarumo srities ekspertai papasakos apie tai, ką būtina atlikti jau dabar, kad verslas sėkmingai ir svarbiausia tvariai augtų ateityje. Tad kas mūsų laukia artimiausias šias 2,5 valandos, tai tenka man garbė atidaryti pirmą sesiją, kur aš pasidalinsiu SEB banko patirtimi ir indėlių siekiant skatinti tvarų verslą. Toliau pakviesime kolegą iš SEB grupės, gerbiamą Karl-Oskar Olming, mūsų SEB grupės Tvarumo strategijos politikos ir valdymo vadovą. Ir jis pristatys, ko galima tikėtis iš Europos Sąjungos taksonomijos. Net nežinau, kaip įverčiasi į lietuvių kalbą, bet kadangi mums ta sąvoka yra labai priimtina, tai turbūt ir vartosim taksonomiją. Taip pat Karl-Oskar pasidalins, kaip ir kodėl bus reguliuojama tvaraus finansavimo rinka, kokie svarbiausi tikslai apibrėžiami toje taksonomijoje, ir turbūt kokios svarbiausias tų tikslų yra įvykdymo pasiekimo datos. Iškart po kolegos iš SEB grupės pakviesim kolegį iš SEB Lietuvos, tai yra teisininkė mūsų, gerbiama Giedrė Vėželė, papasakoti apie svarbiausių teisės aktų paketą bei 3 pagrindinius reguliavimo tikslus. Taip pat kokie papildomi atskaitomybė reikalavimai ateina įmonėms ir ką jau dabar reiktų atlikti arba ruoštis jau atlikti artimiausioje ateityje įmonėms. Toliau džiaugiuosi turėdamas progą pakviesti gerbiamą svečią Tvarumo konsultacijos įmonės Sustaineriai įkūrėją Marko Siller, kurio pristatymo tema yra, kaip įmoniai sukurti tinkamą tvarumo strategiją, kad ji veiktų. Turbūt temos pavadinimas pats pasako prezentacijos turinį, bet svarbiausia tai yra, ką svarbu apsvarstyti, kuriant bei diegiant sistemišką ESG politiką, koncepciją įmonėje. Ir šią sesiją pabaigsime su svečiu iš Estijos, kuris yra maisto pramonės gamintojas Agronė verslo plėtros vadovas, gerbiamas Silverkus, pasidalinti apie jų tvarumo kelionę. Tai yra, kaip žinia, agrosektorius yra vienas taršiausių sektorių turbūt iš visų, kalbant apie įtaką aplinkai, įtaką klimatoj. Todėl neatsitiktinai ir šį sektorių pasirinkome ir jo atstovą norėjom pasikviesti, pasidalinti įmonės tikrą tvarumo istoriją, tai yra vadinamoji case study, kaip įmonei sekasi judėti šioje kelionėje. Išties po kiekvieno pristatymo, jei tik tilpsime į apsibrėžtą laiko limitą, sieksime užduoti po kelis klausimus mūsų pašnekovams. Tad nuoširdžiai raginu visus jūs aktyviai dalyvauti ir pateikti klausimus komentarų skiltyje šiame pačiame ekrane, kur ir matote prezentaciją. Kaip aš paminėjau šiek tiek jau angliškai, tai dalį pristatymo mes pateiksime lietuvių kalbą. Natūralu, kad mūsų garbingi svečiai ne iš Lietuvos, tai papasakos anglų kalbą. Ir labai tikimės, kad toks formatas nesudarys jums keblumų. Išties galvojame visą renginį organizuoti tik anglų kalba, bet išgirdome ne vieną komentarą, ne vieną prašymą iš savo partnerių ir klientų, kad šią temą anglų kalba ir taip yra labai daug turinio, daug prezentacijų, o lietuvių kalba trūksta. Ir todėl nusprendėme būtent tokį savotišką formatą. Tai nuoširdžiai pasakius bus savotiškas iššūkis mums, nes iš tikrųjų mūsų grupėje, banke, iš tikrųjų didžioji dalis turinio yra tik anglų kalba. Mes vertėme net prezentaciją iš anglų kalbos į lietuvių kalbą ir dažniausiai kalbame šią temą angliškai. Tai atsiprašau, jeigu koks anglizmas papuls ir mano kalboje. Turbūt tiek ir iš pasiūlytos dienotvarkės matome, kad tikrai turime labai daug kom pasidalinti. Tad sutilpti 2,5 valandos tikrai, manau, bus tam tikras iššūkis. Ir nieko nelaukdamas, aš ir pradedu nuo pirmosios temos, kaip ir tenka man garbė atidaryti šią videokonferenciją. Ir noriu pasidalinti SEB banko patirtimi ir indėliu siekiant skatinti tvarų verslą. Ir pradėsiu pirmiausia nuo 2 perspektyvų, vertinant verslo poveikį. Tai pirmiausia, įmonių veikla turi tiesioginį poveikį aplinkai ir visuomeniai, tai vadinamasis impact out, vadinamoji perspektyva. Tai yra, kai kalbame apie įmonės veiklą, tai aš turiu minty plačią savoką. Apima ir produktus, ir paslaugas, suteikti išleistą taršą, tai čia ir CO2, vandens vartojimas. Taip pat įmonių veikla apima ir socialinį poveikį, valdymo klausimus ir panašiai. Taigi ši veikla tiesiogiai ir netiesiogiai daro poveikį aplinkai ir visuomeniai. Tai vėlgi tas pats minėtas tarša, žaliavų vartojimas, darbo sąlygos, kaip jaučiasi darbuotojai, energijos vartojimas, miškų nykimas, ir galim tęsti turbūt. Taip? Ir kita perspektyva yra šiek tiek tarsi priešinga, tai yra impact in, tai yra ESG poveikis įmonių finansiniams rezultatams. Tai pavyzdžiui, su aplinka susijusios išlaidos, reguliacinės iniciatyvos, taršos mokesčiai, pramonės transformacija visa būtent tvarumo link, tie patys vartotojų lūkesčiai ir reikalavimai gamintojų ar produktui, mes matom besikeičiančią vartotojų elgseną, įvairios baudos ar net ginčai, bylos turbūt. Ir ta pati vėlgi darbuotojų gerovė, mes galim visai neseniai prisiminti visai neseniai žurnalistinį tyrimą viename sektorėje, kokią įtaką jis turėjo turbūt tų įmonių veiklai. Tai visa tai tiesiogiai ir netiesiogiai įtakoja tiek produkto kainą, tiek pačios įmonės vertę. Tai yra ESG poveikis pačiai įmoniai. Ir šis poveikis ženkliai įtakoja įmonės vertę. Tas poveikis įskaičiuojamas jau vertinant įmonę, kitaip tariant, ESG faktorius tampa viena iš įmonių vertinimo sudedamųjų dalių. Tad uždavinys įmonėms yra valdyti šias abi perspektyvas, kurios vienodai yra svarbios ir aktualios. Ir turbūt suprantama, kad čia negalima pasirinkti vienos. Tai yra jos negali vienos ignoruoti, į vieną labai susifokusuoti, nes jos tarpusavy yra labai susijusios. SEB banke, siekdami įvertinti konkretaus sektoriaus daromo poveikio aplinkai analizę, mes turime tokį verslo klasifikavimo procesą, kurio pagrindu ar tai darydami mes siekiame suklasifikuoti tiek sektorius, tiek klientus, pagal jų darome poveikį aplinkai. Tai tuo tikslu atsižvelgiama į sektoriui taikomus parametrus pagal Paryžiaus sutartį ar kitus įsipareigojimus, bei tą pačią ES taksonomiją. Klasifikavimas kaip toks, turbūt galima pridėti, kad kartu su teisės aktais jisai padeda pertvarkyti arba padės pertvarkyti kapitalo srautus ir, kas svarbiausia, padidins skaidrumą savininkams ir investuotojams. Ir SEB bankas įgyvendina šią klasifikavimo iniciatyvą, kad galėtų geriau suprasti klientų tvaraus verslo įtaką bei tikslus. O taip pat kartu su šiuo procesu mes galime ir padėti tiem patiem klientam, iš tikrųjų verslo įmonėm, pereiti prie mažo CO2 išmetimo kiekio naudojamų technologijų. Pačiam bankui šis procesas leidžia geriau suprasti klimato kaitos įtaką visam SEB banko portfeliui. Taip, visas portfelis kokią turi įtaką. Ir leidžia mums asmeniškai, tai yra bankui, nusimatyti jau savo tikslus ir įvertinti, kaip tie tikslai bus įvykdomi. Aš prie šito šiek tiek grįšiu, nes tai yra labai svarbi ir aktuali tema šiuo metu banke ir visam finansiniam sektoriui. Turbūt gal sudėtingai pristačiau aš šį ratą, bet iš tikrųjų, kitaip tariant, tai klasifikavimas padės suprasti, kur esame šiandien, bei nusimatyti kartu su banko klientais ir tų verslo savininkais bei investuotojais, ką turime padaryti, kad pasiekti Paryžiaus sutartimi numatytus tikslus. O ši skaidrė būtent ir parodo, kokių tikslų ir veiksmų turime imtis, siekiant šitos ambicijos. Tai jeigu mes paimtume 2010 metus kaip bazinius metus ir nieko nekeistume, tai yra ta horizontali linija ties 0%, tai jokio poveikio ar teigiamo poveikio klimato kaitai mes neturėtume, tai reiškia, ta pati emisija ir judėtų. Tai jeigu mes žiūrėtume į Paryžiaus susitarimo užsibrėžtą tikslą, tai yra, kad tą vadinamą 2 laipsnių trajektoriją, tai mums reikia jau 2030 metais CO2 emisiją sumažinti 25%, o 2070 ši emisija turėtų būti, grynoji emisija turėtų būti lygi nuliui. Na ir jeigu žiūrėti į Paryžiaus susitarimo ambiciją, kaip tokia išreikšta, tai yra 1,5 laipsnio trajektorija, kad klimatas nešiltų daugiau negu 1,5 laipsnio. Tai iš tikrųjų ši ambicija yra tikrai dar didesnė ir jau 2030 metais CO2 emisija turi būti sumažinta 45% palyginti su baze su 10 metais, o grynasis emisijos nulis turi būti pasiektas jau 50 metais. Ir čia ir parodomas tos kreivės, iš tikrųjų vizualiai, tai yra vadinama pereinamoji situacija bei laipsniškas pokytis, kurio reikia pasiekti, kad priartėti prie arti grynosios nulinės emisijos kaip tokios. Tuo tikslu, viso portfelio klasifikavimo ir įvertinimo tikslu, mes niekaip negalėtume atlikti be atviro ir skaidraus dialogo su mūsų verslo partneriais, verslo klientais, o taip pat tų tikslų raportavimu. Ir šių diskusijų ar ataskaitų pagalba mes ir siekiam tiek įvertinti įmonių esamas emisijas, bei nusimatytas tranzicijas, tai yra pokyčius, o kartu ir patys, kaip bankas, pasidalinam patirtimi ir įžvalgomis atitinkamam sektoriui, kurios gali būti taikomos. Ir tvarumo diskusijos yra labai svarbus elementas, siekiant visos šios transformacijos, tai yra turbūt galima pavadinti stuburas, apie kurią mes galime tą transformaciją visą toliau, kaip čia, ašis, į kurią galima atsiremti. Taip? Taigi tvarumo diskusijų pagrindą mes turime tokia kaip pagrindinės 3 dalis, sritis, tai mes paliečiam reguliavimą, sektoriaus tvarumo lygius ir SEB vaidmuo kaip banko, kaip pačios institucijos. Tai reguliacinė dalyje aptariame pagrindinės tvarumo iniciatyvas, kurios paskatintų spartų įmonių judėjimą tvarumo link, taip pat tą patį spartų reguliacijos vystymąsi. Ir viso to pasekoje, ir gimė iš tikrųjų Europos Sąjungos taksonomija. Konkrečiam sektoriui aktualioje dalyje mes aptarėme jau aktualias taksonomijos sritis ir tvarumo lygius taikytinus tam konkrečiam sektoriui. Taip pat pasidaliname ir aptarėme esminės tvarumo iniciatyvas ar kritinės investicijas reikalingas tiek trumpu, tiek ilgu laikotarpiu. Ir čia turbūt svarbu pažymėti, kad tvarumo tikslų siekimas tai nėra sprintas, tai yra maratonas, kaip matėte, tikslai yra labai ambicingi ir jie labai yra ilgo horizonto. Apie tai šiek tiek dar vėliau užsiminsiu iš tikrųjų. Ir trečia tema, kurią paliečiame tose diskusijose, tai yra iš tikrųjų, kaip mes kaip bankas, kokį vaidmenį vaidinam tvarumo srityje. Ir čia tikrai stengiamės nebūti šešėlyje, o atvirkščiai proaktyviai siekiame būti lyderiaujančią instituciją verslo tvarumo srityje. Todėl plėtojame žaliuosius finansavimo produktus, apie kuriuos aš tikrai pakalbėsiu šiek tiek vėliau. Ir kodėl čia pažymėta CO2 duomenis, tai iš tikrųjų šiuo metu reguliacija daugiausia dėmesio skiria aplinkosauginiai temai. Mes matome didžiausią bangą reguliacijos būtent CO2, aplinkosauginiai taršos temai. Ir kurioje pagrindinė linija yra būtent tas CO2, tai yra anglies dvideginio mažinimas. Ir labai trumpai iš tikrųjų girdim prašymą pasidalinti, tai kaipgi sekasi tos diskusijos, koks yra grįžtamasis ryšys, ką mes kaip bankas pastebime. Tai čia pabandėme reziumuoti tokias 5 konsoliduojančias, pavadinkim, išvadas. Tai pirmiausia, tai yra aktualumas. Tai neabejotinai visoms įmonėms yra labai aktuali tema, ir tikrai čia galim pasidžiaugti, kad mūsų susitikimuose dažniausiai dalyvauja visi aukščiausio lygio vadovai, net ir patys akcininkai prisijungia. Ir tokia įžvalga iš tikrųjų, kad apie tvarumą yra daug informacijos, forumų, bet trūksta struktūros, aiškaus tokio fokuso iš tikrųjų, kas yra svarbiausia. Ir turbūt čia ir galima paminėti, kad lyg ir laikomės tų priimtinų visuomenėje aiškių standartų, bet kokių dar iniciatyvų reikia imtis, kad jau tapti tikrai pažangiems ir kokius nusimatyti investavimo gairėse tikslus, šitos informacijos šiek tiek trūksta. Ir tas pažymėtina būtent apie politiką, ir duomenis. Taigi, išnagrinėjus tas nedaugelį viešai prieinamų lietuviškų įmonių tvarumo ataskaitas, mes darom išvadą, kad mes tikrai dar esame gan ankstyvame etape. Kadangi dauguma įmonių ne tik, kad neturi tų ataskaitų, bet ir net nėra, pavadinkim, valdymo struktūros sutvarkyta įmonė, tai yra atsakingų pareigybių, procesų, politikų įmonėse, o kaip įmonė judės būtent šioje kelionėje. Ir čia galiu pasidalinti, kad tai tikrai nėra šis iššūkis tik mūsų šalies įmonėms. Tai yra tikrai visam regionui ir turbūt visai ekonomikai turbūt taikytinas grįžtamasis ryšys, bet galiu kartu pasidžiaugti, kad yra ir labai gerų pavyzdžių, kurie mus tikrai labai teigiamai nustebina, iš tikrųjų kaip įmonės yra pažengusios ir kaip jau daug įdiegusios ir pasiekusios šioje srityje. Reikšmingumas. Tai aš jau minėjau šiek tiek, kad gal kartais trūksta tos vadimos governance, valdymo dalies įmonėse. Trūksta dėl to ir žinių šiek tiek apie reikšmingiausias veiklos sritis toje konkrečioje industrijoje, kurioje įmonė veikia. Trūksta fokuso šiek tiek, tai yra nėra aišku, į ką reiktų koncentruotis įmonei, kur teikti prioritetą, kokioms investicijoms teikti prioritetą ir panašiai. Tai yra turbūt tas reikšmingumas ir dėmesys esminėms ESG rizikoms taikytinoms konkrečiam sektoriui, jaučiame, kad dar reikia tam tikro didesnio dėmesio tam. Ir iššūkiai kokie. Tai pirmiausia, kaip minėjau, turbūt reikia suprasti ir įsivertinti, kaip mums sekasi ir ką mes turime šiai dienai. Ir tai yra vienas iš iššūkių, kad yra sunkiai prieinami palyginamieji duomenys. Tvarumo duomenų, tokių kaip tvarumo duomenų paskaičiavimas reikalauja tikrai didelės pastangos, specialistų pagalbos, nėra galutinio aiškumo visam sektoriuje rinkoje, kas, kada ir kokius tvarumo duomenis turi raportuoti. Įmonės labai skirtingai tai daro, pastebime. Mums iššūkis savotiškas bandyti tai sudėti ant vienos ašies, įsivertinti ir suklasifikuoti. Tai yra nemažas iššūkis, nes iš tikrųjų skirtingos metodikos ir turbūt nėra vieno kelio kol kas. Na ir iniciatyvos. Tai įmonėse tikrai yra daug iniciatyvų startuoja, jas svarbu įvertinti, turinčias ir prioritizuoti tas iniciatyvas, kurios turi didžiausią poveikį klimato kaitai. Kaip minėjau, tai nėra sprintas, tai yra maratonas, tikslai yra ilgalaikiai, jie siekia 2050 metus ir toliau. Ir norėčiau pažymėti, kad iš tikrųjų čia mūsų grupė atliko analizę, kad rodo, jog tie tikslai, kurie šiandieną iniciatyvos, kurios yra orientuojamos tų tikslų siekimui, jos rinkoje yra mažiau ambicingos negu finansinis sektorius kelia savo tuos tikslus, o savo tai reiškia ir klientam. Ir paskaičiuota, kad rinkos sektoriai skaičiuoja vidutiniškai apie 30% emisijos sumažinimą iki 2030-ųjų. Tuo tarpu didžioji dalis Šiaurės Europos Nordic bankų, finansų institucijų užsibrėžė savo tikslus mažinti 40 ar net 50% CO2 emisiją iki tų pačių 2030-ųjų. Tai reiškia, yra tam tikras tarpas, skirtumas tarp to, ko finansų institucijos tikisi, tiek iš savo klientų, tiek pati kaip savo nusibrėžė ambiciją, tiek kaip rinka, kaip verslo įmonės, kokius tikslus savo siekėsi. Tai be abejonės su laiku turės būti suvienodinta ir sinchronizuota. Kol kas daug kalbėjau apie banko ir verslo įmonių santykį, bei jų kelionę tvarumo link. Bet kaip žadėjau, keletą minučių noriu skirti ir apibendrintai apžvelgti ir pačio mūsų SEB banko tvarumo kelionę. Taigi, kokia ta įtaka yra mūsų visuomeniai. Ir SEB grupės analitikų duomenimis, jų paskaičiavimais, prieita išvada, kad tiesioginė banko įtaka aplinkai sudaro vos 5%. Ir tai yra tikrai santykinai labai mažai palyginti su 95% mūsų daroma įtaka per teikiamas paslaugas ir ar produktus, suteikiamą finansavimą, alokuojamas investicijas ir panašiai. Tačiau nepaisant to, vis sritys yra vienodai labai svarbios mums ir mes siekiame būti pirmi kaip organizacija ir kartu padėti klientams finansuoti tvarios veiklos projektus. Taigi, SEB grupės iškeltas ir viešai skelbiamas tikslas yra sumažinti absoliučią CO2 emisiją iki nulio jau 2045 metais, kas reikštų, kad Baltijos šalims tai yra apie 5,5 tūkstančiai tonų CO2. Tokia buvo mūsų emisija 2019, 2020 jinai buvo ženkliai mažesnė, bet pandemijos metai mes suprantam, kad ir verslo kelionių, ir kitų turbūt emitentų ar emisijų buvo mažiau, tai jie tokie išskirtiniai metai, už tai referuoja 19 metų emisiją. Ir, galėtų kažkas pasakyti, kad 2045 metų tikslas dar yra labai toli ir čia tikrai nėra aišku, kaip mes tą pasieksime. Todėl SEB grupė mes turime numatytus tarpinius tikslus. Ir pavyzdžiui, CO2 emisijos tikslą mes skelbiame kasmet mūsų tvarumo ataskaitose. Ir nuo 2018 metų iki šių metų pabaigos visa grupė siekia sumažinti 25% praktiškai emisiją, 6,5 tūkstančiai tonų CO2. Taip pat yra numatyti kiti tarpiniai tikslai, tai yra iki 2025 metų CO2 emisija turi būti 2/3 mažesnė, negu ji buvo prieš praėjusią finansinę krizę 2008. O dar po 5 metų, tai yra 2030-aisiais, mes sakom, turi būti jau 4 kartus mažesnė negu 2008-aisiais. Tai yra 75% mažesnė. Tai šie tarpiniai tikslai yra tikrai svarbus siekiant laipsniško, bet pamatuoto progreso siekimo kasmet. Tai kaip mes siekiame tos tiesioginės įtakos mažinimo? Tai CO2 emisijos skaičiavimai ir įvairios iniciatyvos, kaip jas mažinti, tai yra nuo skraidimo lėktuvais ribojimo iki žaliosios energijos pirkimo savo veiklai, griežtų reikalavimų tam pačiam banko autoparkui. Mes dar nuo 2012 metais turėjome 130 CO2 reikalavimą visiems banko automobiliams. Taip pat aplinką tausojančio popieriaus naudojimą. Dar pabrėšiu apskritai, kad mes stengiamės eliminuoti popierių iš savo veiklos iš viso, tai yra kur tik tai įmanoma, tai yra turime įdiegę vadinamuosius skaitmeninius filialus, digital branches, kur viskas gali būti padaroma tik skaitmeniniam formate, jei tik klientas turi tinkamas identifikavimo priemonės ir elektroninio parašo priemonės, taip, dokumentam pasirašyti. Tokie filialai tikrai netolimoje ateityje turbūt dominuos visame mūsų banko filialų tinkle. Taip pat šiukšlių rūšiavimas, plastiko vartojimas. Prisimenant šiukšlės, tiesa, gal teko girdėti mūsų kartu su Pauliu organizuotą kavos tirščių rinkimo programą, kur vėliau surinkti kavos tirščiai per daugelį mėnesių banko viduje geriamos kavos surinkti kavos tirščiai, jie buvo panaudoti žaliosios energijos gavybai ir kitos iniciatyvos. Bet dėl laiko stokos aš negaliu plačiau išsiplėsti ir, kaip minėjau, tiesioginė įtaka tai yra tik 5% mūsų absoliučios įtakos klimatui. Tad pažvelkime, kokios iniciatyvos ir tikslai keliami netiesioginiai įtakai visuomeniai. Matau, laikas mane dėja spaudžia, aš norėčiau dar daugiau papasakot. Tai gal aš tik paminėsiu apie tvarios plėtros pasiūlymus. Tai yra, kad produktus ir paslaugas, kurie ženkliai prisideda ir ateityje labai įtakos turbūt verslo transformaciją tvarumo link. Tai kokie tie finansavimo sprendimai šiuo metu yra SEB grupėje ir Baltijos šalyse, tai yra, pradėsiu nuo žaliųjų obligacijų, tai obligacijos, jos kaip ir standartinės obligacijos, tik pritrauktos lėšos griežtai naudojamos projektams, kurie daro teigiamą poveikį aplinkai. Dar gali būti socialinės obligacijos, tai tokios obligacijos pritrauktos lėšos naudojamos socialiniams tikslams arba sveikatos, pavyzdžiui, sistemos stiprinimui ir panašiai. Tai jos gali būti vadinamos tvariosios obligacijos. Grįžtant prie žaliųjų obligacijų, tai šią koncepciją džiugu, jog dar 2007 metais sukūrė SEB grupė kartu su Pasaulio banku ir tai buvo kaip atsakas į padidėjusi investuotojų norą ženkliau prisidėti prie tvarumo skatinimo ekonomikoje, versle. Ir pirmoji tokia žaliųjų obligacijų emisija Lietuvoje buvo organizuota SEB banko kartu su kitais 2 tarptautiniam finansų institucijom 2017 metais, tuometiniai Lietuvos energijai, 300 milijonų eurų emisijos dydis ir paklausa kartais viršijo šitos emisijos dydį. Tai iš tikrųjų rodo investuotojų susidomėjimą ir norą prisidėti prie šio instrumento. Žaliosios paskolos iš esmės tas pats, kas obligacijos, kad tai yra paskola. Keletas sakinių apie su tvarumu susijusias paskolas. Tai kai dažniausiai palūkanų norma, bet gali būti ir kažkokios kitos paskolos sąlygos, yra susiejamos su kliento viešai deklaruotais tikslais ir ambicijomis siekti tvarumo tikslų. Tai pavyzdžiui, kliento įsipareigojimas sumažinti CO2 emisiją, tai arba gali būti paskolos ekologiškoms statyboms su labai aplinkai draugiškų produktų kūrimu ar diegimu ir panašiai. Tiesa, Lietuvoje šios paskolos mes dar turime galutinėje, pavadinkim, patvirtinimo stadiją, tačiau tikimės, kad jau netrukus jau netrukus galėsime pasidžiaugti pirmosiomis tokiamis paskolomis ir pas mus Lietuvoje. Vėliau parodysiu, kaip tai yra pasaulyje, kaip tai jos evoliucionavo. Žaliosios būstų paskolos, vėlgi dar nagrinėjimo stadijoje Lietuvoje, bet SEB Stokholmas, SEB grupė Švedijoje labai populiari paskola, iš tikrųjų tai yra ekologiškam ir tvariam būstui įsigyti skirta būsto paskola. Na ir žaliasis leasingas tikrai jau daugelį metų turime, tai yra mūsų banke, tai yra nulinės emisijos elektromobilių leasingo finansavimas leasingo būdu, išskirtinėmis sąlygomis, skatinant tikrai autotransporto mažinimą, emisijos mažinimą. Ko aš čia dar nepaminėjau, tai turbūt yra tvarios investicijos SEB pensijų fonduose. Ir pastebime, kad kaupiantiems pensijai vis labiau svarbu, kad jų pinigai būtų investuoti į tvarią ir atsakingą veiklą. Ir pasitikrinau su kolegomis iš investicijų valdymo, tai mūsų investiciniai fondai į tvarią veiklą šiai dienai jau yra investavę daugiau negu 540 milijonų eurų, kas yra apie 40% viso valdomo turto vertės. Na, pažiūrėkime, kaip šie produktai evoliucionavo pasaulyje, pasauliniu lygiu. Ir iš tikrųjų matome eksponentinį šių produktų apimties augimą. Ir iš viso pernai metais žalių ir tvariųjų finansinių skolos priemonių apimtį sudarė virš 700 milijardų JAV dolerių. Ir tai yra iš tikrųjų eksponentinis augimas, rodantis didžiulį tiek finansinio sektoriaus, tiek investuotojų susidomėjimą šiuo tvariu instrumentu, ar tvariais instrumentais reiktų pasakyti. Atkreipsiu dėmesį, būtent pilkas tulpelio dalis ir yra su tvarumu susijusios paskolos, kur aš minėjau, kad palūkanų norma gali būti pririšta prie tvarumo tikslų. Ir matome, tik 2018 metais jos realiai, pavadinkim, tapo labiau matomos rinkoje ir jau pernai 120 milijardų JAV dolerių tokių paskolų globalioje finansų rinkoje suteikta. Tai iš tikrųjų įspūdingas šuolis, įspūdingas augimas. Manau, kad tai ateitis tikrai visų naujų finansavimo instrumentų. Vėlgi, o kaip sekasi mums Lietuvoje? Tai buvo pasaulinė skaidrė. Tai mes irgi džiaugiamės, kad Baltijos šalyse turime tvaraus finansavimo gražių pavyzdžių. Anyfin Green, Sunly yra estų SEB banko pavyzdžiai. Lietuvoje mes pernai turėjome labai gražų stambų tokį, pavadinkim, išskirtinį sandorį vėjo parkui pirmajam be jokių subsidijų iš vyriausybės. Tai yra LVS, energijos grupės įmonė, 45 milijonų eurų finansavimas vėjo parko statybai. Ir jis pripažintas ir įtvirtintas kaip žaliasis finansavimas. Visai neseniai, galbūt matėte, mes prieš savaitę berods skelbėme Renergai, koncerno Chemos grupės suteiktą, grupės dukterinį įmonį suteiktą žalį finansavimą, 10 milijonų eurų vertės, vėlgi vėjo parko statybos finansavimai. Žaliasis leasingas nėra didelės apimtis, bet labai stebina augimo tempas. Ir palyginom šių metų pirmą ketvirtį su praėjusio pirmo ketvirčio, apimčių augimas yra 4,3 karto. Tai iš tikrųjų rodo, jog ir šis tiek tokie automobiliai, tiek pats finansavimas, jisai tampa itin patraukliu. Taigi, apibendrinant paskutinę skaidrę, ir nors čia joje pateikiu tik didžiasias Šiaurės Europos finansų institucijas, bet iš tiesų tai visos pagrindinės finansų institucijos neabejotinai, bekompromisiškai integruoja ESG veiksnius į savo veiklą ir atitinkamai koreguoja tiek produktus ir paslaugas, tiek kreditavimo politiką, tiek rizikos prisiėmimo apetitą ir politikas, tiek nusibrėžia tikslus ir priemonės, kaip sieks ir kaip tai monitorins, seks Paryžiaus susitarimo tikslų įgyvendinimo. Tuo tikslu turime turėti ne tik deklaratyvius tikslus, bet ir juos mokėti išmatuoti, skirstyti, analizuoti. Tai yra didelis iššūkis visoms industrijoms, tame tarpe ir pačiam bankui. Tačiau patinka mums tai ar ne, sunku tai ar lengva, visa verslo visuomenė turės tai pradėti daryti. Ir neabejotinai mūsų laukia viena didžiausių transformacijų ir reguliacinės aplinkos turbūt sugriežtinimas, kuris tikrai, kaip minėjau, įtakos ir kapitalo srautus, finansavimo sąlygas, finansavimo prieinamumą ar net kainą. Tad iš tikrųjų laukia išties įdomi, bet kartu ir labai ypatingai svarbi verslo tvarumo kelionė, tad nepavėluokite prisijungti į tą kelionę ir aš nuoširdžiai dėkoju už dėmesį. Ir kadangi matau, jog mano pristatymo laikas šiek tiek viršytas, tai jeigu tokie klausimai pateikti, kuriuo aš dėja neturėjau progos pažiūrėti, aš juos atsakysiu mielai mūsų sesijos videokonferencijos metu. O dabar norėčiau pakviesti mūsų kolegą iš SEB grupės, Karl-Oskar Olming, pristatyti SEB grupės, pristatyti taksonomiją, tai yra ko tikėtis iš būsimų pokyčių. So, dear Karl-Oskar, hello again and welcome to our webinar. So I kindly invite you to present your message about the taxonomy, what we can expect from it, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vilius. Thank you very much for this introduction, and I will just share my slides with you and get going. So I have been asked by Vilius to talk a little bit about what's going on in this platform on sustainable finance in this working group that I'm a part of, and just to give you the little bit better understanding of the context. The Commission basically has a team of experts that advise them on regulation and in particular the development of the taxonomy. And this team is called the Platform on Sustainable Finance. It has 57 members and it's a mix of members from sector organizations or trade and industry organizations, finance, NGOs and individual experts like professors and so on. From finance, there are not that many, but there are two banks. So SEB is one bank and the French bank BNP Paribas is the other bank. So we are trying to give the banking focus in this. And I would like in the next 30 minutes to give you a little bit about the big picture, what's happening about sustainable finance. Now I lost the pictures. Someone. Okay, excellent. Give the big picture and so how all these regulations link together. Give a little bit about the April package. So in April, a lot of new regulations came out, and then go a little bit deeper into the EU taxonomy, how it works, and what is the latest with the delegated act that came out in April. And then what is the work that is going on right now in the platform? So what can you expect going forward? And when we talk about sustainable finance regulations, we really have to go back a couple of years, basically until the Paris Agreement in 2015, because I think that was an eye-opener for the EU and many countries, that in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need really to change the way our economy works. And to do those changes, there is enormous amounts of investments needed in Europe. At that time, the thinking was about 270 billion euro annually, at least for the next 10 years. And those amounts are not something that the public can provide for those kind of investments. It needs to come from the private. So what they did was they developed a Sustainable Finance Action Plan, a European action plan on how to mobilize funding for the transition to a more sustainable economy. And that was built on the ambitions that we had in 2017 early 2018. But with the new commission coming in December 2019 with the von der Leyen commission, the ambition level increased considerably. Instead of talking about reduction of greenhouse gases about 40% by 2030, we now had ambition of 55% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And the same came in the area of biodiversity, circular economy, the area of energy, and so on. So basically, with this increase in ambition, the Commission also realized we need to further increase the ambition of our Sustainable Finance Action Plan. So in a couple of weeks' time, the Commission will release a renewed sustainable finance strategy with even more ambitious targets and mainly focusing on transition, which was not really the key focus in the 2018 package. But now we focus on the existing action plan. That's what we know what it is about, and it's still a lot of things that we need to kind of to understand and see how it will affect us. And this action plan consists of 10 different actions that are supposed to stretch across the whole investment chain, and it has 3 main objectives. The first objective is to reorient capital flows towards more sustainable investments. And how do you do that if you don't have a definition of what is a sustainable investment or a sustainable activity? So the number one of their initiatives was to develop a taxonomy with a classification of activities that are sustainable. But with that, they can then build other type of standards and labels. For example, the EU Green Bond Standard that is coming out in a few weeks is built on the taxonomy. The European Eco Label for funds is built on the taxonomy. But they also did other things, such as number 4 here, incorporating sustainability in financial advice, basically ensuring that all existing financial regulation integrates sustainability either in advisory or in evaluations, for example. The second area of action was to integrate sustainability in risk management. And the reason for that is partly because it was a realization that we are coming to a situation where if we don't act, we will see a lot of stranded assets in the transition to a low carbon economy. So financial markets need to understand what are actually the risks stemming from sustainability issues, including climate change. So they have an action here to create requirements on how rating institutes should integrate sustainability. They put requirements on financial market participants on disclosures when it comes to how to integrate sustainability, both in their investment in terms of how it in fact impacts financial value of an asset, but also in terms of the impact on planet and society. And then they also requested the European Banking Authority to look into whether it's possible to integrate sustainability in prudential requirements. So basically how much capital that a bank needs to hold in relation to its lending. And this, of course, is kind of going into the core of banking. And the EBA will come with a report by 2025 latest on how this will look like. The last area was to create transparency and long-termism, both in corporate and financial markets. And doing that by now I lost myself again here, by making sure that disclosure regulations for corporates are updated, and making sure that there is stringent governance about or sustainable corporate governance for companies. For example, how should they do their due diligence? What should be the duties of directors in relation to shareholders and other stakeholders? And how does this all link together? Well, I said earlier that the taxonomy is kind of a basic feature for many other regulations to work. But you could also look at it in this way, and that is, and before I go there, I should just say, normally EU regulation goes very slowly, but in this area, in less than 3 years, we already have 4 legislations active: the taxonomy, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, we have fiduciary duty number 4, and sustainable benchmarks number 5, and we have another 3 coming up in 2021. So we are really in a decade of sustainable finance regulation. And how does this all link together? Well, let's look at it at a very simple picture here. If you look at capital flows from a very general perspective, we have retail consumers who are saving on the bank, or they're investing in funds through a financial market participant. These investments, they are going into corporates, among others, but corporates is one main destination. The corporates have not been that regulated before in terms of how they need to disclose. But with these upcoming regulations, the European Union and the Commission puts a lot of requirements on exactly how a corporate needs to report. With the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is the follow-up to the non-financial reporting directive, they put very defined areas of how to report. With the Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive, they define how to do due diligence, how they should set targets, etc. With the taxonomy, they set the definition of what they may call sustainable activities, and the EU Green Bond Standard sets requirements if they want to fund themselves in capital markets using the EU Green Bond Standard. This information is then used by financial market participants, and they're also being regulated. So they are being regulated in terms of how to use this information from a risk perspective in the disclosure regulation, and how to use this to define what they call sustainable products. And then they have to also disclose their taxonomy alignment, just like corporates have to do it, and integrate it in different types of fiduciary duty regulations. And in turn, they provide different types of services to the retail consumer. And here the Commission requires how they should disclose information about how they deal with sustainability issues from a risk perspective and from a product perspective in the disclosure regulation. And if you provide advice to a consumer, you're forced to integrate sustainability in that advisory. So ask them, do you want to consider sustainability in your investments or not? And if you want to do that, well, then we have these kind of products, and these kind of products have been standardized according to these regulations. So the effect of all this is basically that you get much more of a streamlining about what is sustainability, and it means that it will be easier for capital to flow to sustainable activities because it's one approach to what is sustainable activities. So if we should look into the kind of the crystal ball, what will happen in the future, we can expect that there is reorientation of capital flows to more sustainable activities, going into funds that are sustainable funds, investing in companies with a high alignment of taxonomy, or with companies that are having a high capex, so they are investing towards taxonomy alignment, for example. Moving forward, and going down into what the taxonomy is. I mentioned it is a classification system for sustainable economic activities, but how is it built up? Well, basically, it consists of 6 environmental objectives. The first 2 are climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, and that is the part of the taxonomy that has now been finalized. The remaining 4 objectives are circular economy, pollution prevention, water protection, and biodiversity. And the way the taxonomy is constructed is to basically look at what are the sectors in the European Union with the highest climate change impact. So they came up with a number of sectors. And in these sectors, they basically looked at what are the activities in these sectors and how can we define what is performance that could be considered sustainable. That means on a trajectory towards Paris, the Paris Agreement, or supporting the way that the European Union economy needs to traject to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So if you are in a sector covered by the taxonomy, and you have activities in that sector that is covered, in order to be taxonomy aligned, you need to fulfill 3 criteria. The first is that your activity needs to meet the technical screening criteria of the taxonomy for that activity. So, for example, if you are producing electricity, the technical screening criteria says that if you do that below 100 grams per kilowatt hour, which is the technical screening criteria, that should be considered a substantial contribution to climate mitigation. But you also need to do no significant harm to the other 5 objectives. And that generally is setting a floor of how you need to perform in these areas. And normally that is EU, different types of EU environmental legislation, but it could also be other things. For example, when it comes to energy again, the level for doing a significant harm is 270 grams per kilowatt hour, and there is no legislation around this. So basically, very good gas combined heat and power gas plants could perform on that level, and for the rest, it's different types of renewable energy. The third area is that you need to comply with minimum social safeguards, and that is defined in the OECD recommendation for multinational enterprises and the United Nations guiding principles of business and human rights. So if you fulfill those 3 areas, then that activity can be called taxonomy aligned. And currently we have the taxonomy for climate mitigation and adaptation, and this will start apply from 1st January 2022. Now, how will you have to report as a corporate and as a financial institution? Well, this is not totally clear, but we will get that within 2 to 3 weeks from the Commission. However, the consultation that they sent out showed that the Commission intend to require corporates only to disclose what activities they have within the taxonomy, not whether they are taxonomy aligned or not. So basically, your turnover that is within the taxonomy, but not whether it fulfills the requirements of the taxonomy. And then the next year, you have corporates would have to report on taxonomy alignment. So we will see whether this is what will be in the final in the final delegated act on disclosure or not. And who has to report? Well, it's large corporates and financial market participants that have to report on the EU taxonomy. Now, this is just to show you how it would work for large corporates and financial market participants. On the right side, it is a large corporate, and they have to report on turnover, so percent turnover aligned with the taxonomy, or percent capex aligned with the taxonomy. So both these will be important. So even though you have low turnover today, you might have a high capex because you're investing in production methods that are aligned with the taxonomy. And sometimes you can also report on operational expenditures if relevant. On the left side, we see how this would be treated from a fund perspective. So a fund having 2 different companies, one healthcare company and one energy company. So it's a total portfolio of 100%, but 50% weight of each of them. The healthcare company would be a part of the measurement, but they would not be having any activities that are part of the taxonomy and therefore also no aligned activities. While the energy company, all of their activities would actually be part of what is covered in the taxonomy. So that is column 2. However, if you look at the case of this company, only wind power and hydropower would be taxonomy aligned. So for the company, 80% of their activities would be taxonomy aligned, and for the portfolio, 40% would be taxonomy aligned, as the healthcare companies also included. Now, coming to what happened in April and the April package that I talked about in the beginning, because there was and there were 4 main things that came out. First, we got the EU Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act. So now we have the thresholds and the do no significant harm criteria for climate change and climate change mitigation and adaptation. We also got a proposed corporate sustainability reporting directive, so the follow-up to the non-financial reporting directive. And looking at it, we see that it provides much more detail, much more granularity as how corporates should report, but it also puts increases the scope of companies that need to report. So now what they propose is all listed companies should report, even SMEs that are listed. And they also put more requirements on the assurance of corporate reporting. The third part that came out were amendments to existing financial regulation to include sustainability, and among others, they looked at fiduciary duties in MiFID II when it comes to how you integrate sustainability in valuations. In IDD, how you integrate sustainability in advice, investment advice. And as I mentioned, and we got one more thing, and that was the European climate law. That is, of course, the biggest thing here. And the climate law is now a law that requires the EU and its member states to reduce greenhouse gases by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels, and reaching neutrality by 2050. So the left side acts are basically going to support reaching the climate law. But now our member states and the EU are forced to implement or take action if they see that we will not fulfill these targets. So if you take it from a transition risk perspective, we will see more and more regulation to make sure that we will reach these targets. Coming down to the EU Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act, there were a lot of political discussion before it came out. Some countries opposed it, for example, some Nordic countries when it came to forestry and bioenergy, while others opposed it for other reasons, such as the inclusion of gas and so on. And in the end, in order to find a solution, the Commission decided to leave out a few sectors. So the agricultural sector is out at the moment, and that's because the common agricultural policy is still being negotiated, and there was not really a possibility to keep it in without having the bigger framework of the CAP finalized. Natural gas and nuclear is also out. Nuclear has never been part of the taxonomy, but natural gas has been kind of in and out. And this is because of there is a bit of a political lock between France and Germany. France who wants nuclear and Germany who wants natural gas in it. And instead of kind of letting them stall the whole process, they put it out, and these areas will be put together or put forward as separate delegated acts during the year. Now, is the Climate Delegated Act now finalized or not? Well, actually, it needs to go. It has been formally adopted, but there needs to be a no objection from Parliament and Council. And is that going to happen or not? Well, generally with delegated acts, it's very difficult to for the Parliament to reach a majority to object to the act. So we can expect that it actually happens from 1st January 2022. Now, what were the big changes compared to what the first report was on the consultation? Well, for buildings, there were a lot of discussions all the way into the final taxonomy. And now what they say is that either you have energy performance certificate class A, or you are within the top 15% of the national or regional building stock. This is important because the EPC class is different for different countries, and it would have created very different applications if they only would have used EPC class approach. For forestry, general forest management is included now. But the company needs to have a forest management plan, a climate benefit analysis, and a guarantee of permanence for the forest status of that area. And to do that, they need to do an inventory or an audit every 10 years. And very small forest owners are exempted from this requirement. Transport was no changes, basically, except for batteries came in, so manufacture of batteries is now taxonomy aligned, but transport is an important sector, and 50 grams of CO2 per kilometer will stay until 2025, and after that it's zero tailpipe emission. That is the main criteria. Bioenergy is in as long as it's not produced from feed crops, and it has to comply with the RED II, which is an EU criteria for bioenergy. And it's not defined as a transitional activity. It's a fully accepted right now. And then there were some things on hydropower, how you define do no significant harm, and also on hydrogen that have been that were kind of important updates. When it came to adaptation, I think the important part to say here is just that compared to mitigation, adaptation is not normally using turnover as the metric, but expenditure. And the reason is because you look at expenditures relating to make an activity climate resilient. It is only in situations where you are enabling adaptation. So if you make storm shelter or something like that, well, and that is a part of an enabling activity for adaptation, then it is your turnover of building that is included. Now coming into what's happening in the taxonomy in the platform at the moment, what are we working with? So what can you expect in a couple of years? Well, the immediate work that is happening is to develop the remaining 4 environmental objectives. So circularity, pollution prevention, water, and biodiversity. And the same approach applies here as for climate, looking at what are the sectors which have a significant impact on these environmental objectives. And as you can see, there are slight changes. So, for example, mining is coming in, tourism is coming in, a lot more manufacturing is coming in. So we will see an expanded taxonomy when we also expand the environmental objectives. And these, so at the moment, there is an ongoing work to develop technical screening criteria for different activities in these sectors. And in August and September, there will be a consultation on this. So I very much encourage you to follow the development of this and be part of the consultation if you're in one of these sectors, to make sure that the end result is really relevant and simple to use. Moving forward, another area that is going on in the platform is the development of an extended taxonomy, in the sense that currently we have a taxonomy that only looks at what is sustainable activities, but if you are not meeting the criteria, what are you then? You are just not taxonomy aligned, but you're not unsustainable, You are just having an undefined performance. The idea moving forward is to develop more types of nuances to the taxonomy. So you get a taxonomy showing also what would be performance at a significantly harmful level, and by that also having a level intermediate between harmful and taxonomy aligned. And adding to that, if you have activities that are potentially not having any significant impact, it is also important to know that, because that is very different from being significantly harmful or intermediate. When you have that, a corporate would be able to show their transition story much easier, describing both how you're performing today, but also your ambition in the future to move into the intermediate space, or what type of no significant impact activities that you have. So an idea with this is really to provide more ability of corporates to show their transition moving forward. Another area that is going on in the platform is a social taxonomy. And the idea here is similar to an environmental taxonomy, but the logic is slightly different. The environmental taxonomy was very much focusing on having a scientific and evidence base. Here we get much more of international norms and principles. And we also, if we look at the current development, there are three areas that they are looking into. The first one is to look at how corporates as entities, not in terms of activities, are respecting human rights. And they're trying to develop a framework based on the UN guiding principles of business and human rights on how to define substantial contribution for respect for human rights. Same thing is happening for governance, but my bet is that they will be more prone, or it will be easier to develop it from a human rights perspective, as governance, for example, anti-corruption is already very much in legal frameworks, and it's difficult to perform better than the law if you have a zero tolerance towards corruption. But that is my own take on this. And then the last part is to develop a taxonomy for different types of social activities. And these activities are, for example, social housing or production of certain medication and so on. So very much in line with how you develop environmental define environmental activities, but here it would rather be accessibility, affordability, and the like. So this is what we can expect a concept for moving forward. That brings me into the timeline for this and what we can expect in the coming years. And if we look at the bottom here, there are a lot of dates, but basically we can say that in 2021 we get the delegated acts on both climate mitigation and adaptation and how to disclose. And that will enter into force, so we have to report on it in 2022 for this year. And then next year we get another 4 objectives in a delegated act. So for next year we will have to implement all the 6 environmental objectives so that we can report in 2023 on 2022 for all 6 environmental objectives. If you look at the top here, we see that between June and September, and basically July to September now, we will get reports from the platform on sustainable finance. And those reports will basically be consultations where you can provide input on how they define the conceptual approaches, or for remaining objectives, the screening criteria. And then we have the dotted lines or the dotted boxes, and they are very much my best guess of the timing for taking these reports into potential delegated acts. And what you see there is that my guess would be at the earliest, we would have a delegated act on a harmful taxonomy and a social taxonomy by January 2024. But this is, of course, very much subject to the Commission. So with that, I would like to finish and hand back to you, Vilius.
Yes, thank you, dear Karl-Oskar. Really insightful presentation. Really showing what is going to happen in the future. Even though we are a little bit behind the schedule, but there's really a good question, which I also had in my mind. And thanks to our listener for the provided question. Why there are different base year when setting the targets? For example, minus 40% if compared with 1990s, minus 30 if compared with 2010. And when I made the presentation, I also was thinking, actually, we do have different baselines. For EU taxonomy 2010, the SEB group established targets from 2008. Can you comment on
that? Yes, good question. Actually, 1990 is kind of the starting point for the Kyoto Protocol. So all the countries have started measuring from 1990. So it does make sense and to start there, and of course, and I think also from a political perspective, starting at 1990, you will see more progress than if you would start 2010. 2010 is the time when the International Panel on Climate Change starts their kind of model, their modeling and so on. So a lot of the scenario analysis that is made has data from 2010 onwards, because the scenarios have been built 2010 to 2050. So that's why these differ. And then, as you might know, for example, the IPCC have come out with saying we need to reduce our emissions by 50% each decade. So that is basically 2020 to 2030, 50%, and then another 50% to 2040, and so on. That is the exponential roadmap. That is a concept. So yes, there are different baselines, and there are reasons for that. Now in SEB, well, we did start measuring in 2008, but and therefore we continue to have that as a baseline, because that's the first date when we started measuring our own footprint. Now we are moving into measuring our whole credit portfolio's footprint, which is a little bit different ballgame.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Much clearer now. Really, once again, big thanks to you, dear Karl-Oskar, for really this insightful presentation. And I kindly invite our next speaker, who is our colleague from SEB Lithuania. First, I will switch to Lithuanian. Taigi, maloniai kviečiu mūsų sekantį pašnekovą, prezentuotoją, tai yra gerbiama kolegė Giedrė Vėželė, SEB banko teisininkė, papasakoti apie skaidrumą, kuris ir yra pagrindinis tvarių finansų elementas. Taigi, Giedrė, žodis tau.
Ačiū, Viliau. Sveiki visi. Aš esu atsakinga SEB banke visose Baltijos šalyse už su tvarumu susijusių teisinio reguliavimo sekimą ir kiek įmanoma jo įgyvendinimo stebėjimą. Todėl šiandien ir pristatysiu Jums, koks mano nuomonė yra pagrindinis tvarių finansų elementas ir ko mums labiausiai trūksta šioje mūsų kelionėje tvarumo link. Kaip jau Karl-Oskar pristatė gana išsamei, kad yra 3 tikslai, kuriuos numato Europos komisija savo tvaraus augimo finansavimo veiksmų plane. Tai visų pirma, kapitalą skirti tvaresnei ekonomikai, didinti skaidrumą ir atsižvelgti į ilgalaikę perspektyvą, nes buvo pastebėta, kad dažnai dėl kapitalo rinkų spaudimo įmonės atlieka veiksmus, kurie augina vertę trumpalaikėje perspektyvoje, tačiau ilgalaikėje perspektyvoje yra netvarūs. Ir trečias tikslas yra integruoti tvarumą į rizikos valdymą. Tai reiškia, kad visi turi suprasti, jog rizika klimato kaita kelia ir tą riziką valdyti. Europos komisija planuoja šiuos tikslus įgyvendinti per visą pulką reguliacinių iniciatyvų. Didelė dalis jų yra skirta investavimo produktų reguliavimui, nes gana didelė problema buvo vadinamasis greenwashingas, kai investicinis produktas pristatomas kaip tvarus, tačiau giliau pažiūrėjus paaiškėja, kad tik nedidelė dalis lėšų yra investuojama į tvarias veiklas, o likusi dalis yra investuojama į tvarius sprendimus, tvariais sprendimais nepasižyminčias veiklas. Tačiau šiandien mes daugiau kalbėsime apie tuos teisės aktus, kurie yra aktualūs mūsų klientams, kuriuos mes kredituojame, ir duosiu kelis praktinius patarimus, ką jau dabar reikėtų padaryti. Tai visą šį reguliavimą galima suskirstyti pagal tikslus į 3 grupės. Tai pirmoji grupė yra skatinanti skaidrumą, informacijos atskleidimą, antra grupė rizikos valdymą ir trečioji poveikio aplinkai mažinimą. Bankams iki šiol nėra tokio reguliavimo, kuris nustatytų bankams tikslus sumažinti CO2 emisijas ar kitaip atlikti kažkokį tai pokytį. Tačiau tik balandžio mėnesį Europos Sąjungos parlamentas, taryba ir komisija susitarė dėl Europos klimato teisės akto, kuris būtent ir įtvirtino teisinėme reguliavime pačius siekius sumažinti CO2. Tai konkrečiai iki 50 metų tapti neutraliu žemynu klimatui, taip pat iki 30 metų sumažinti CO2 emisijas 55% ir žadama, kad antrame ketvirtyje šių metų Europos komisija pateiks konkretesnį planą, kaip atskirų sektorių įmonės turėtų prisidėti prie CO2 mažinimo ir pateiks planą į kokius teisės aktus, kokias reguliacinės iniciatyvas šiuos planus įdėti. Bet kad būtų aiškiau, kodėl apskritai skaidrumas yra svarbus, galbūt pradėkime nuo kito tikslo, nuo rizikos valdymo tikslo. Tai bankai privalo vertinti ir valdyti riziką, kurią kelia klimato kaita. Yra išskiriama fizinė rizika ir pereinamojo laikotarpio rizika. Fizinė rizika reiškia, kad bankas turi vertinti, kad jo klientas gali arba jo veikla, arba įkeistas turtas nukentėti dėl tokių veiksnių kaip sausros, potviniai, karščio bangos, vandens trūkumas ir kiti. Šiai dienai Lietuva nėra prie tokių šalių, kurios būtų ypač paveikios fiziniai rizikai. Tai yra daug aktualiau tokiom šalim kaip Nyderlandai, kur daugiau negu 50% paviršiaus yra žemiau jūros lygio, arba tokiam šalims kaip Ispanija, Prancūzija, Italija, kuriuose yra labai dažnos karščio bangos, sausros. Tačiau vis tiek reikia stebėti ir ilguoju laikotarpiu ši rizika gali tapti aktuali ir Lietuvai, ypač jeigu klimato kaita tęsis tokiu pačiu tempu. Kita rizika, šiuo atveju daug aktualesnė, yra pereinamojo laikotarpio rizika ir ji reiškia, kad kliento veikla tikriausiai nėra laikoma tvaria ir kad dėl perėjimo prie tvaresnės ekonomikos klientas gali susidurti su įvairiais iššūkiais, tokiais, kad galbūt keisis pačios įmonės vertė, galbūt turės klientas pertvarkyti savo veiklą. Tai reikš bet kokiu atveju papildomus kaštus, o gal ir veiklos modelio pokyčius, ir bankas apie tokius pokyčius kaip partneris turėtų žinoti. Pavyzdžiui, turbūt gana savaime suprantama, kad įmonė, kurios veikla paremta iškastiniu kuru, turės pertvarkyti savo veiklą ir galimai dėl to patirs nuostolių. Ir kad pailiustruočiau šių rizikų poveikį, papasakosiu, prieš kelias dienas Europos bankininkystės institucija paskelbė savo atlikto pilotinio tyrimo rezultatus, būtent apie klimato kaitos keliamas rizikas. Šiame tyrime dalyvavo 29 didžiausi Europos bankai, jie pateikė informaciją apie savo klientus, stambaus verslo įmonės. Ir šio tyrimo rezultatai buvo tokie, kad daugiau negu pusė bankų kredito portfelio yra skirtas sektoriams, kurie galimai bus jautrus pereinamojo laikotarpio rizikai. Daugiau negu 30% banko kreditų portfelio yra skirta įmonėms, klientams, kurių CO2 emisijos yra didesnės negu vidutiniškai. Tik nepilnai 8% kreditų portfelio yra laikomi investuotojais į tvarias veiklas ir nei bankai, nei jų klientai neturi duomenų reikalingų tokių skaičiavimų atlikimui. Tai ar šie skaičiai, kuriuos aš ką tik pasakiau anksčiau, yra reprezentatyvūs? Nežinau, aišku tik tiek, kad tikrai didelė dalis bankų kredito portfelio yra skirta sektoriams, kurie yra jautrus pereinamojo laikotarpio rizikai. Tačiau faktas tas, kad mums tikrai visiems trūksta duomenų tam, kad galėtumėm suprasti savo rizikas ir taip pat, kad jas galėtumėm valdyti. Ir būtent tam ir yra visa atskira rolė skirta skaidrumui ir pagrindiniai jos veikėjai yra taksonomijos reglamentas ir bendrovių tvarumo atskaitomybės direktyva. Karl-Oskar jau gana išsamiai papasakojo apie taksonomijos reglamentą, todėl aš labai daug neapsistosiu prie šios temos, bet labiau norėsiu papasakoti apie būtent mūsų klientams, įmonėms skirtus nefinansinės atskaitomybės reikalavimus, kurių dalis yra išdėstyta taksonomijos reglamente, o dalis įmonių tvarumo atskaitomybės direktyvoje. Čia tik trumpai priminsiu, kad taksonomijos reglamentas apskritai padeda mums suprasti, kas yra laikoma tvaria veikla. Jis tai suskirsto į 6 tikslus, dalis jų įsigalios 22 metais, dalis 23 metais. Šiai dienai mes žinome kriterijus, kokios veiklos laikomos tvariomis, jei jos prisideda prie klimato kaitos švelninimo arba prie prisitaikymo prie klimato kaitos. Taip pat tokia veikla turi nedaryti žalos kitiems su aplinka susijusiems tikslams, atitikti bent minimalius žmogaus teisų apsaugos principus ir praktiškai visą tai turi būti patikrinama, kad būtų išvengta to jau minėto greenwashingo. Tai jums, kas galėtų būti aktualu taksonomijos reglamente, kad jis įpareigoja atskleisti, kaip ir kokiu mastu įmonės veikla yra susijusi su tvaria veikla. Tai yra taikoma tik įmonėms privalančiams skelbti nefinansinę atskaitomybę ir labai daug šansų, kad jums nereikia jos šiuo metu skelbti, tačiau ateityje ši įmonių ratas, kuriams reikės ją skelbti, plėsis, todėl galbūt vis tiek verta atkreipti dėmesį. Ir yra nustatyti skirtingi rodikliai finansų įstaigoms ir nefinansų įstaigoms. Ką mes tikrai šiuo metu jau žinome apie nefinansų įstaigas, tai yra bet kurią įmonę, kad jos turės skelbti apyvartos dalį, kapitalo išlaidų dalį ir veiklos išlaidų dalį susijusią su produktais, paslaugom, turtų procesai siejamai su tvaria veikla. Finansų įstaigos turės skelbti rodiklius, kurie yra specifiniai, kadangi finansų įstaigų pagrindinė veikla yra kredituoti kitas veiklas, o ne jų pačių veikla nėra priskiriama prie tvarios arba netvarios. Tačiau tai yra gana nedaug, tai kas yra paskelbta, ar ne, apyvartos dalis, kapitalo išlaidų dalis ir veiklos išlaidų dalis. Daug konkretesnis duomenų rinkinys turi būti nurodytas deleguotame akte, kurio projektas buvo paskelbtas vos prieš kelias dienas. Turint omenyje, kad ši pareiga bus taikoma nuo 22 metų, tai reiškia, kad jau už 21 finansinius metus šią informaciją reikės skelbti, tai toks projekto paskelbimas yra gana vėlyvas ir gana sudėtinga bus pasiruošti jam. Juolab, kad tvari veikla ir patikrinimas, ar atitinka taksonomijos reglamente nustatytus kriterijus, tai yra gana imlus laikui darbas. Galimai dėl to deleguotame akte ir atsirado nuostata, tarsi pereinamojo laikotarpio nuostata, nustatanti, kad nuo 22 metų reikės tik tai skelbti, kokia įmonės veiklos dalis apskritai yra minima taksonomijos reglamente. Tai tarkim, pavyzdžiui, pagal taksonomijos reglamentą naujų pastatų statyba būtų laikoma tvaria veikla, jeigu naujas pastatas turi pakankamai aukštą energetinio naudingumo klasę, taip pat jeigu daugiau negu 70% atliekų yra perdirbama ir jeigu naudojamos netaršios priemonės ir medžiagos statyboje, taip pat keli kiti rodikliai. Tai jeigu dabar nuo 22 metų, kaip ir nurodyta deleguotame akte, mums reikės neskelbti, kokia įmonės dalis, veiklos dalis yra tvari, o kokia tiesiog yra paminėta taksonomijos reglamente, tai tokia įmonė galės skelbti, kad 100% jos veiklos yra paminėta taksonomijos reglamente, o tik nuo 23 metų turės paskelbti, kokia dalis jos veiklos atitinka taksonomijos reglamente nustatytus reikalavimus. Tai manau, kad yra gana rimtas palengvinimas, bet manau, kad kita vertus jisai buvo neišvengiamas, nes tiesiog fiziškai nebūtų įmanoma pasiruošti tokiam informacijos atskleidimui iki 22 metų sausio 1 dienos. Kitas svarbus dalykas, tai kad tai anksčiau minėti duomenys, jie turi būti įtraukti į nefinansinę atskaitomybę ir, kaip ir minėjau, nefinansinę atskaitomybę šiuo metu skelbia labai mažai įmonių. Šiuo metu reikalavimas skelbti nefinansinę atskaitomybę taikomas tik tais viešojo intereso didelėms įmonėms, kurios turi virš 500 darbuotojų. Tai kitaip tariant, yra apie 20 įmonių Lietuvoje, kurios skelbia nefinansinę atskaitomybę. Pasikeitus nefinansinės atskaitomybės direktyvai, kurią pervadina į bendrovių tvarumo atskaitomybės direktyvą, turės ją skelbti visos didelės įmonės, nepriklausomai nuo to, ar 500 darbuotojų ar mažiau ir nepriklausomai nuo to, ar tai yra viešo intereso įmonė. Ir visoms įmonėms, kurių vertybiniais popieriais prekiaujama Europos Sąjungos reguliuojamai rinkoje. Tai kitaip tariant, visos didelės įmonės ir tos mažos ir vidutinės įmonės, kurių vertybiniais popieriais prekiaujama biržoje. Skaičiuojama, kad to pasekoje turės nefinansinę atskaitomybę skelbti virš 320 įmonių Lietuvoje. Taigi daug šansų, kad jūs jau pateksite prie šių įmonių po šios direktyvos priėmimo. Taip pat, kas yra svarbu, kad šiai dienai pagal šią direktyvą skelbiama nefinansinė atskaitomybė, ji buvo nepalyginama, duomenys buvo nekonkretus. Kiekviena įmonė skelbė tokią informaciją, kokią pati savo nuožiūrą nuspręsdavo, kad ji yra reikalinga. Po pokyčių atskaitomybės turinys bus labai detalus, jis turės būti pakankamas tam, kad įmonės partneriai, klientai, investuotojai galėtų gerai suprasti įmonės veiklą, taip pat, kad galėtų patys įgyvendinti jiems taikomus teisės aktus. Ir ta informacija bus standartizuota, skaitmenizuota, su tikslu, kad tai galėtų būti palyginamas turinys. Deja, iki šiol koks tiksliai bus tas turinys, dar nėra nustatyta. Šį duomenų rinkinį dar turi parengti tokia konsultantų organizacija, tačiau tikėkime, kad jie gana greitai jį paskelbs. Ir paskutinis pokytis su šia direktyva ateis toks, kad nefinansinės atskaitomybės turinys turės būti audituojamas. Iki šiol auditoriai tik patikrindavo patį faktą, kad čia ataskaita yra, tačiau nuo šiol turės patikrinti tam tikrų lygių ir turinį. Ir planuojama, kad įsigalios šie pokyčiai nuo 23 metų, o mažoms ir vidutinėms įmonėms listinguojamoms nuo 26 metų. Tai jums rekomenduoju tiesiog sekti šios direktyvos priėmimo procesą, kad įsitikintumėte laiku, pamatytumėte, jeigu ji jums bus taikoma. Ir taip pat rekomenduoju iš anksto pasirūpinti, kad tiekėjai, klientai, partneriai jums pateiktų informaciją, kuri bus reikalinga šios atskaitomybės parengimui. Todėl, kad bent jau kaip paties banko praktika rodo, tai yra labai imlus laikui rankinis darbas, reikalaujantis susitikimų, reikalaujantis kruopščios analizės, ar tam tikra veikla yra tvari ar ne. Todėl tuo reikėtų pasirūpinti kaip įmanoma labiau iš anksto. Ir apibendrinant, galbūt ir verta būtų paminėti, kad visų pirma, matyti reikia suprasti, kad finansuotojai, tiekėjai, klientai prašys vis daugiau informacijos apie jūsų nefinansinę veiklą, tai tiek apie CO2 emisijas, tiek apie tiekimo grandinę, tiek apie tai, kokią veiklą jūs užsiimate, ar atitinka taksonomijos reglamentą ar ne. Taip pat be abejo pasitikrinkite, ar jūsų veikla laikoma tvaria. arba sužinokite, ko trūksta iki kriterijų įgyvendinimo. Išsiaiškinkite, ar pasikeitus teisės aktams jums bus privaloma skelbti tvarumo atskaitomybės dokumentus ir galiausiai, kaip jau ką tik minėjau, pasirūpinkite, kad tą informaciją, kuri reikalinga tvarumo atskaitomybės dokumentams parengti, jūs gautumėte laiku. Tai yra viskas, kuo norėjau šiandien su jumis pasidalinti. Tikiuosi, kad buvo naudinga ir kad suprasite, kodėl bankas vis daugiau ir daugiau informacijos prašys apie nebūtinai finansinius įmonės rodiklius. Dėkui.
Taip, ačiū Giedrė, labai įdomu ir tikrai didelis teisės aktų paketas artėja ir bus daugiau įpareigojimų ir lūkesčių iš įmonėms pateikti. Aš matau klausimų skilti vieną klausimą, kurį turbūt galėčiau atsakyti labiau pats, bet aš šitą dėl to nukelsiu į mūsų klausimų atsakymų sesiją po visų pristatymų. O dabar noriu pakviesti kolegą iš Sustainere įkūrėją, tai yra tvarumo konsultacijos įmonių Sustainere įkūrėją, gerbiamą Marko Sillerą. So, dear Marko, I am pleased to have you on stage here with us as you will share the sustainability strategies, so how to create it, that it would really enable companies to progress and move forward to it. So looking forward to your presentation and welcome on stage, on virtual stage, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon. I got somehow lost here in Teams, so I hope you can unmute me and you can hear me well. All good? Yes? All good, great. So thank you for the introduction and well, my plan here today is to bring all these things which you have heard before into a bit more practical layer before we will go to another even more practical, a company case study after my part. So let's talk about so everything, well, mostly as I understood what Karl-Oskar was saying about the taxonomy and the regulative trends. So shortly we can say that all these trends require more strategic, more conscious and more systematic approach from businesses, from you. So that's what's the purpose of my presentation, to give you some suggestions and hints for that. Shortly, although we were introduced, so we are a sustainability advisory firm. I'm greeting and talking with you here from Estonia, but working also elsewhere. And shortly, I would say that we support our customers with sustainability strategies, with mostly environmental impact analysis, as this is also one of the focuses of today's event as well, and then with a monitoring and reporting, and you can recognize several names with whom we have been working. Before I go into my core slides, it has been discussed here, and I will also use two terms. So we're talking about ESG, the environmental social governance, which is mostly, I would say, that how your company manages those impacts which your business activities have. So what are how do you manage your environmental impacts? How do you manage your social impacts? And how do you implement the good and responsible governance practice or responsible business conduct? And I have given some like subtopics also there. So what do we mean by those? So what do we mean by environmental, social, or governance impacts? The other term is sustainability or sustainable development, and this is relevant for your companies to understand and plan. So how your products, how your service and core business can contribute to the either it is alleviation or solving of some of the most burning societal problems or challenges. So either it is global warming, what we are discussing here a lot about, or some other environmental challenges, biodiversity loss, depletion of resources, or some social bottlenecks which our societies are facing, inequality, public health issues, employment, income, and education of so-called vulnerable societal groups, gender inequality, etc. So of course there are a lot of overlapping between those two terms, but somehow we look at them separately as well, but still we talk about them jointly together here. So my purpose with the upcoming 15 minutes is to give you 8 pieces, as I call them. So what you should consider when you start creating a solid strategic approach to those topics, ESG and sustainability. And basically those 8 pieces are based on actually, or where do they come from? The same European regulations or legislation. So they talk about, or these talk about the same elements basically. So you can see those across or coming through across different EU regulations. Also the different voluntary frameworks or standards which are used for managing ESG or sustainability topics. So I have given some major logos for those. So all these standards, more or less similarly, they are built on the same 8 pieces or elements. Of course, there are many other angles, but you can find linkage to those 8, which I'm going to talk about basically in all of them, and also those sustainability indexes and ratings which evaluate the companies and their ESG and sustainability management performance. And thirdly, like this is a good market practice. So this is what we see that companies are doing, and yeah, also gives a reason to talk about those 8 pieces. So let's go one by one. And firstly and foremost, it should start, and your strategic approach to those issues must start from knowing your impact. And well, if you take an example of a climate impact, which is measured as a carbon footprint of your organization or your product or service, so there are certain standards created for that, which you also should use. And like if you talk about the impact, then we don't talk about this untangible, qualitatively described impact only. So as much as possible, you should quantify, you should assess and evaluate your current impact, what your business operations have on the society. And on the example here, which I have given, so it can be either your company environmental impact in terms of your carbon footprint, so or it can be your product or service whole life cycle impact, which you can also assess. I'm not going to stop here for a long, but this is like a brief introduction to what Silver, who's from Agrone, will talk after me. So how they evaluated their carbon footprint and their product footprints, so which considers both their direct emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions into the air, emissions from their energy consumption, but also emissions from those input materials, those so-called upstream activities which happen before the company. And actually you can also measure the footprint like for those activities which happen or take place after the products leave the gates of your company. So the usage phase, the sales and usage phase of the products until the end of the life cycle. So this is how you can quantify your impact. But even more like climate impact or carbon footprint is like, although the most relevant one right now and mostly discussed these days, there are other even environmental impacts which are not considered as a part of carbon footprint. So there is one example for one Estonian production company for whom we, besides the carbon footprint, which you can see with the yellow color here, we evaluated also other or quantified also other kind of environmental impact areas. So what is the impact of their business activities in different value chain steps? So their company was in this processing and assembly phase. So what happened before, within, and after their own 4 walls or their company. So what was the impact to biodiversity, to the depletion of resources, waste generation, and water usage? So some of the other major environmental impacts. Or an example from another production company from cement industry here. An example where we have not been involved, but just to showcase you that like you can also quantify your social impact. So this is an example of Cemex, where they have put into one picture so the blue pillars, which reflect their financial contribution to the society, so how much salaries and benefits they pay, how much they pay for taxes and interest and dividends. Also, they have added and quantified what is the impact of their social contribution, so how much they contribute to the talent development of their own employees, how much they give the community investments. Also, in the brackets, you see the numbers which reduce the impact, so occupational health and safety, so if some occupational injuries or incidents happen, so then they can give like a quantitative value for that. And the same goes for different environmental impact. So like carbon has a price, air emissions have a price, water consumption has a price. So like how they impact the so you can basically like quantify all the externalities and then find out the total impact of your company. So you can take a look at this impact from a very different angles, but this is where you should definitely start from. The other keyword which I suggest here is to build a strategy upon a double materiality. And what we mean by double materiality is that on one hand, what is the material societal impact on the company? So those so-called outside-in aspects. So all the external sustainability factors, either it's global warming or biodiversity loss, whatever it is. So how these risks and these aspects affect the value of the company, often also the financial value. So you should consider that. And then on the other hand, what are those material impacts which your company puts on the environment, on people, on societies and economy? So this inside out impact. So what do you cause by your own business activity? So both should consider. This is what we call a double materiality. In other words, a bit different angles. Your strategy should look at both. So what are the risks that the social and environmental trends put to your business? So what you should watch, what you should adopt in order to mitigate those risks. But on the other hand, like how you can contribute. So what is your opportunity to contribute to solving those problems? Which takes us to the third keyword, which I wanted to highlight here. Your sustainability strategy must tackle the societal problems. So all these EU regulations are also meant, in the end of the day, for that, not just to be some, not just for nice, to be nice, but in order to make companies to pay attention how they can tackle the societal problems. So it is no surprise that we have such issues and bottlenecks globally, locally. So the strategies of a company should take those into consideration, and then like you should see ideally yourself as a part of the solution of tackling those problems, not causing. Well, the universal framework for defining what are those, or somehow frameworking, what are those global issues or problems is the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, each of them have also more specific targets, 169 in total, and then also even more specific indicators. And like this is a framework which also gives a good platform for businesses, seeing that, okay, what are those societal problems, either environmental problems, social problems, governance problems in the society, which somehow reflect to my business sector, and how I could be part of the solution. So how my product, services, my business model could contribute to solving those problems. And then if you manage to do so, then without no doubt you are aligned well with the EU taxonomy, all the regulations, demands from your investors, etc. So this is one of the frameworks. If this is too far, then there have been done a local analysis as well. So this is an example of one of the major sustainable development goals, like scoring radar or index on a country-based level. So there are, based on certain indicators, it has been said, so how Lithuania is doing in each of those 17. This is just a summary picture, but you can like zoom in into all of those, saying that like, okay, based on what do we say that like climate action is like a red, so not doing very well in Lithuania, or like the responsible consumption and production as well. So based on which indicators do we say that? So you can take it to a local level as well. Another element which I suggest you consider is that like the strategy should be built on stakeholder engagement, and like your activities in terms of ESG and sustainability management must consider stakeholder expectations. Why? Because they give you the license to operate. So as simple as that, to operate or even to grow. Whatever exactly do we mean by growing in this context? So it is not only the owners and investors who you should consider, or employees and customers who might be other like this nearby or like the closest stakeholders, but also your suppliers, subcontractors, vendors, other kind of cooperation partners, financiers, investors for sure, but also policymakers, authorities. Why not professional associations within your industry, media, of course, and civil society, different kind of NGOs and pressure groups, local communities who are around your premises, the municipalities, the residents, educational institutions, etc., etc. So there are many stakeholders who are affected by your decisions, and vice versa, whose opinion directly or indirectly affects the sector and the development within the sector where you operate. So wiser to be aware of those expectations than to start adopting afterwards. So rather be aware of those expectations a bit ahead. There is just like one example to give you. In Estonia, there was a few years ago a plan to build a so-called billion factory. Well, this reflected the cost of the investment which was planned. And there was a plan to build a biorefinery in Estonia, and it was never built. Of course, there might be a bit different reasons, but publicly we know that the main pressure was like a local stakeholder or local community against this. So some simplified, if you put it into a very simplified answer, is that well, the investors or the company did not manage to engage the stakeholders since the very beginning of their planning the plant or the process. So and then that's why the local community was, and like the society in general was against it, and like they never built it. So why you need to have this dialogue with the stakeholders? Just an example from Lithuania, from Ignitis Group. So if you take a look at their annual report, so they have defined who are their stakeholders and which stakeholders are interested in which of the sustainability or ESG topics. So this is what you should do. Another element is that you must work across the value chain. So your impact mostly is not only the direct impact which happens within your four walls, but outside. So before your company and after your company, but you can influence it even indirectly. So an example from Bonava, a construction company, who says that, okay, we want to reduce the climate impact or carbon footprint of our own operations, but we understand that like we need to also choose also input materials and cooperation partners whose footprint is smaller, and we also need to educate and engage our customers and like the habitants of the houses or buildings which they built in order to reduce the impact there. Or like one of my so-called favorite examples is from such a bit controversial sector as it is like a fast food sector. So a Swedish fast food chain, Max Burgers, who say that like they also want to reduce their carbon footprint. We all know that like well, the meat which they use within the burgers like has a huge environmental footprint, but what is a part of their plan is that like the red line, which is decreasing, says that like the sales of the red meat meals must decrease. At the same time, the sales of the non-red meat meals, also vegetarian burgers, must increase. So they still provide service or a product for their customers, earn their profit, but like with a lower impact. So how you can engage your whole value chain. And then another thing where I want to stop is that like you need to make a bold statements. You need to say out what is your ambition, what is your plan. Many companies have pledged, so they have made statements. Mostly we see those recently around the climate ambitions. So who wants to become carbon neutral, who wants to become a carbon negative or climate positive, who wants to reduce some percentage of their footprint. So different approaches. But the idea is that like once you say out the ambition, then your stakeholders can take you accountable for the progress towards those goals. Because if you don't say out your targets and ambitions, then later you can report whatever success as a great success, and nobody actually can say that like whether you tackled and whether you solved some of the real issues or you picked some low-hanging fruits. You made it look green, and we can call it the greenwashing. So that's why you must say out your ambitions and targets. Where do you want to reach? And then later to report about the progress there. But it's not only about the carbon or climate impacts. So an example from Carlsberg, where they have promised statements in other aspects as well. So besides zero carbon footprint, they say that like zero waste to water waste, zero irresponsible drinking, zero accident culture. So, well, we're not going to go into there and asking how they ensure that there is zero irresponsible drinking in the society, but still, like they seem to have a plan for that. And in the end of the day, well, the last but not least of my 8 pieces is that you need to make it happen. So once you have the plan ready, you know where to go, how to go, you need to make it happen. And this is where we see that often companies are struggling. So how to integrate, how to implement all those plans. So like how to make your organization ready for that. It's very different in different sectors. So that's why I'm not stopping here long, but yes, you need to think out who are involved within your company, who has the responsibility, how to increase the internal capacity, how to engage your employees, how to train them, how to build the policies in order to create this joint understanding across the team, how to ensure that you consider all that in the supplier management, in your external communication, how you do the monitoring and reporting, etc., etc. So all those things must be thought through. And last of my 8 pieces is that it somehow ends up, but then starts again with transparent reporting. So like as we do with the financial reports, the ESG indicators, KPIs are coming next to that. We see more and more companies reporting their bottom line as a triple bottom line. So what has been their environmental performance, social performance, governance performance. As we heard from Karl-Oskar's and then the other previous presentations before, this is the information. These are the disclosures, what the market, your stakeholders start requiring from you. So you must think about it. So how you provide it. Also for the consumers who don't want some like very technical formulas, but how you communicate your progress transparently and credibly without the greenwashing for them as well. So this, I would say, this is the last of the 8 pieces. So this is what I wanted to suggest for you to consider when you want to build a solid ESG and sustainability strategy, a strategy what actually makes sense and which in the end of the day is beneficial for your business as well, because like there is no point just to waste the time of doing something. So you need to systematically approach that. And this is the picture what I wanted to suggest. This is where I stop. I know that after my presentation, there will be a case study from Agrone and like which mostly tackles this knowing your impact part. So this is where I stop. Thank you, and yeah, I hope it was useful.
Yes, of course. Thank you, dear Marko. Really very interesting, and I think many companies will get valuable insight out of your suggestions and insights. So thank you once again. I'm checking. I don't see specific questions for your good presentation in the comment section. So I encourage all our listeners, if you have those, please don't be shy and provide them in the comment section. So we will have 15-20 minutes Q&A session after the last presentation, which we will hear now. And so yes, please provide these questions. And now, as said, I invite our last guest speaker, representative from Estonian agro company Agrone, dear Silver Kus, to present their case study, their story, their journey towards the sustainable business. So, dear Silver, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Is my presentation on? Is it visible? Yes.
Yes, it is.
All right. So my name is Silver Goose and I'm presenting the company called Agrone. And I would like to agriculture, where we are today and where we came with those principles. And then in the second part of my presentation, we'll focus on the carbon footprint mapping and results of those and some of the kind of assessments from our side. So first, I would like to start with commercial overview of Agrone Group. I mean, our commercial footprint, let's call it so. We are one of the largest agriculture groups in Estonia. Our main activity is actually production of raw milk. We are producing every year 59,000 tons of elite class raw milk, and which constitutes approximately 6% of the total raw milk production in Estonia. We also have quite a sizable agri-land portfolio, which is 13,000 hectares. Where we are actually growing, half of it is used for growing a feed crop for our animals, but part of it is also used for growing grain for the sales purposes to third parties. So we have a bit more than 30,000 tons of every year grain harvest. We have close to 9,000 cow herd today. And we do also have egg production. We have a bit more than 120,000 chickens and producing 30 million eggs per annum, which is like 15% of the Estonian egg production in total. So our commercial footprint in Estonia is quite sizable, and therefore it's also quite big responsibility in terms of our society and also in terms of environment. And now I'm going to talk about our environment topics. So I'm not focusing on other ESG factors like governance and social, but I will focus more on the environment side. So how do we see in Agrone currently the agriculture business going forward in next 10 years? We see clearly that the sector needs to be transforming, and it comes purely very directly from the EU policies. First of all, Green Deal, and secondly also the sub-policy from farm to fork. We also see that the consumer behaviors are changing, local communities' expectations are changing towards agriculture companies, and therefore we see that it's quite essential for every agriculture company to think about sustainability business model and to address actually the main topics there. And for us, it's currently, of course, the agriculture companies are impacting the environment in many ways. The biggest of it is definitely climate change, but there is also impact on the biodiversity, definitely, and there is also impact on the water uses. These are, to our understanding, three most important environmental impacts what we are actually involved. And how we see the transformation drivers. First of all, EU regulations are tightening, which concerns using of, for instance, pesticides, using of plant protection supplies. Then we see also that likely it's coming through that in next budgeting period in European Union, the direct subsidies for farmers and also the investment subsidies will be partly related to the condition that whether you are dealing with the environmental issues, first of all, climate or not. So if you don't, then likely you will be receiving less subsidies in the future. Then what we also see is that the dairy companies who are actually on the export markets are more and more paying attention to the climate impact, especially carbon footprint. And we also see that the younger generation in the consumer side, they are also starting to pay attention to the environmental footprint of agri companies. And last but not least, which is a very important area, which is actually developing very fast nowadays, is that investors and creditors' expectations towards environmental issues on the agri companies the requirement levels are increasing very rapidly, and those companies who will address the environmental issues, those companies will still have good accessibility on the credits and equity as well, and also the margins are going to change in a way that companies who are dealing with the environmental issues, they will likely get in the future lower margins, and it's actually already visible today on the Baltic commercial banking as well. So there are a lot of drivers which are clearly showing the road that agriculture companies must become more sustainable, and that there is no other way to our understanding. And in Agrone, what we have done so far, I mean, actually we are in the beginning of the road, we might say so. We have started this thinking in 2019. We also first exercise what we have done was the thinking that whether we stay as a classical agriculture company or to become a fully organic food production company. And our case study showed that in our case, where we have been consolidating Estonian agricultural companies quite significantly in recent years, and our farms and farming complexes are quite sizable. For our case, it's very costly and also commercially not viable today to turn our company fully organic. So we have made a strategical choice that Agrone will stay as a classical agricultural company. We will not become 100% organic. Some parts of our group may come organic, but in general, we will stay a classical agriculture company, meaning that we are going to use also in the future mineral fertilizers and pesticides. So this is our way how we are thinking. But meantime, of course, we are doing every step what we can to reduce our environmental impact as much as we can. What we have done so far is also that we thought that how to begin with the transformation, and first of all we prioritized climate impact, and we have also mapped all our environmental impacts, and we also then did our first carbon emissions mapping. In the end of last year, in the second part of last year, we started and actually ended in the first quarter of this year, and it was based on the 2019 figures. And at the moment, we are running the second mapping, which is concerning 2020 results and production, and we will finalize it just now in the middle of June. And In the second quarter of this year, at the moment, we are on the halfway to work out for Agrone quite hefty and long-term sustainable business model, or actually the action plan and strategy for next 9 years, which is consisting the most important measurements and actions what we do. There are basically 3 pillars. There are actions which we are basically changing some of the ways how we are cultivating land and how we are keeping our animals. Then there is a second pillar which actually needs quite significant investments in order to make a change. And then there is a third pillar where we say that we cannot make with our own actions the environmental impact near to zero, and we actually need to go and also offset some parts of our carbon footprint in the future. But as said, top priority at the moment is to deal with climate impact, but secondly, we definitely will also take into focus the water usage and the biodiversity, which in our case are also very important. And what we mean our actions, I mean, what we do in practical way. First of all, in order to start any big change, you need to educate your own personnel on sustainable business model and circular economy. So we have held quite a lot of seminars and kind of teaching days for our employees and management. We have taken also quite a lot of external advice. And it's actually continuous work. It's not stopping. Secondly, we have started regularly to measure CO2 emissions on annual basis. As said, we have done first mapping so far, and the second is running at the moment, and we have decided to make it every year now. Then what else? We are also planning to take more and more into use self-sufficient circular model operations, meaning we will use as much as we can our own resources and circular different resources in our production sites. We also are aiming to implement full digitalization of our entire production value chain inside our group. We have a lot of data in Estonia which is already digitalized, but the challenge there is that a lot of those databases are separately in separate platforms, and the challenge is how to get those data pieces together, how to make mass analysis, and to get the really good and overwhelming results out of our data, and to make in the end of the day good management decisions. Fifth, we are planning to replace fossil electricity and heat with renewable energy. This is on one side it's quite low hanging fruit, but on the other side it's also quite expensive when you are going to have a biogas plants, which we are planning to build to have energy for our machinery and to sell it also outside. We are, actually, we are planning to replace fossil energy on our machinery and also in our buildings, on our grain dryers, etc. We are also planning to look over our usage of mineral fertilizers, plant protection products, and also animal pharmaceuticals. To use them as less as possible, but as much as really needed for a good production efficiency. We also need to solve animal manure methane emissions with anaerobic biogas plants. As said, this is a very big part of our carbon emissions, and one cannot really avoid it. So it's very important part of any agriculture company who is producing milk. And then we also are actually currently auditing and looking over our land cultivation practices, how we cultivate land, how much we go on the fields, what we do on the fields, and to really optimize our machinery usage on the fields. So this is a kind of very brief list of actions, what we are looking for. Definitely, it's not a full list, and there are many sub actions. But basically, these are the areas where you need to look into it when you are involved in the agricultural production business. Then I would like to go to the second part of my presentation, which is related then our first experience on climate impact mapping, meaning the carbon footprint mapping. As said, we started it in the second part of last year and actually finalized it in the first quarter of this year. It was first experience for us, and we have done it together with Estonian company Sustinere, where you just had a previous presentation from Marko. So we have been cooperating with Sustinere for some while now, and really happy with this cooperation. So what were the cornerstones of the carbon mapping for us? Our goal of the study was to assess our climate impact on whole Agrone Group. We have 6 agricultural production companies in different regions in Estonia. We have our headquarters in Tartu city, which is in the central Estonia. So our aim was to get understanding and awareness that what is our footprint in every separate company, and what is our footprint of the main office, and what is our carbon footprint also on 3 main product groups what Agrone Group is producing, meaning 1 kilogram of milk, 1 kilogram of eggs, and 1 kilogram of grain. The methodology what we used together with Sustinere was greenhouse gas protocol, which is internationally widely accepted standard for mapping greenhouse gases. When we look this methodology, then basically what it does is it's mapping all 6 most dangerous and hazardous greenhouse gases, and it's basically looking also your circular or actually your value chain, and it's dividing your emissions basically into the 3 scopes. The first scope is your own direct production emissions, which are related, which are in your house, in-house, and which you can have the most of the impact. For instance, in the milk production, it's mostly how do you produce the feed for the animals, dairy cows, how do you treat the dairy cows, how to handle manure, and all these elements are taken into account. The second scope is basically purchased in electricity and energy, which has very direct impact on the emissions. And the first scope is also indirect for us. It's everything we buy in, starting from the additional feed for the dairy cows, starting from the fertilizers, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, all the supplies, basically what we buy in from third parties. So and then we can, like Marko already presented, that there are our own activities, which are mainly scope 1, and then there are upstream activities and downstream activities. So the cutting point for us was that we didn't take into account, for instance, the transportation of the supplies, and our downstream emissions cutting point was the milk and grain and eggs as a ready-made products on our gates. So we didn't take into account the transportation, the goods to the end consumers or to the dairy processing plants, for instance. So and if you go into the upstream activities, what we took into account, basically we took into account, like said, all the purchased products and services. We didn't took into account our capital goods, meaning mainly the buildings and the machinery, because it's very hard to estimate nowadays capital goods emissions, especially for the buildings where some of the buildings are originated from the Soviet times, and nobody knows of those materials emissions nowadays. So we excluded the capital goods. We took into account all our activities related fuel and energy consumption. Like said, we didn't took into account the transportation of the supplies. We took into account all the waste what we generate during the production. We took into account our personnel business trips, the emissions related to that, mainly to the air flights. And we also took into account the commutes of our employees, meaning their road from home to work and backwards. And as said, we didn't took into account leased assets, mainly agricultural machinery. And assessment of the milk, when we go into the details here, that how the assessment of the impact of 1 kilogram of milk was calculated or assessed. It's very important that it's taken into account 1 year data, and we took into account all the farming inputs and processes what we have inside our house, including cultivation of the fields and producing of the feed, and also the grassland. Everything was what happens with the grazing and grassland. So and it's also important to mention that in case of milk, the milk production itself, the end product, it's in order to get internationally comparable figures, then all the milk production is converted into the fat and protein corrected milk. There is an international formula existing which you can use to have your milk calculated into the fat and protein international standard. So you get internationally comparable emission figures as well per milk kilogram. Assessment of the impact of 1 kilogram of grain. We have made assessment for our different articles like wheat, oats, barley, rye, and triticale. These are our 5 main cultures what we produce. And we took into account the dry material content of those articles, 88%. So all the inputs were taken into account in the production. And we also took actually into account also the soil emissions from the field. The soil actually it absorbs CO2, but it also gives emission to the CO2. So and we also then calculated out from all our fields what is the sequestration of the or observation of the CO2 on our fields. So I can show later the figure as well. And here are the overall results of Agrone Group. Very practical overview of our emissions in the 2019 year. Our total emissions were 66,000 tons, which is quite sizable. In Estonia, as a country, our total emissions are near to 20 million tons. Nobody knows exactly how much it's from the agriculture sector, but assuming it's between 1.5 to 1.8 million tons is the agricultural emissions. So Agrone's emissions are rather sizable, but it's also due to our commercial footprint. And if you look the scopes, then we can see that near to 70% or 68% of our emissions are related to our own direct emissions, and it's very much everything what we can influence and what we can do in our everyday production. Second scope was energy. There we can also change it with the buying in renewable energy or starting to produce, for instance, with solar panels, the solar energy or wind energy. The scope 3 is the second biggest. It's everything which comes to the supplies. So it's very sizable as well. So and what we calculated also from our land uses of 13,000 hectares is that our land usage actually absorbs or sequestrates 3,700 tons of CO2 every year. So we can not calculate it or deduct it from the overall emissions, but we can deduct it when it comes to the products emissions. And when we go to the milk production, then our calculation or assessment showed that Agrones Group average milk CO2 emission is 1.0 kilograms per milk kilogram. So it's important to, or easy to compare that every kilogram of milk on our gate is emitting actually 1.0 kilograms of CO2. And when we look on the milk production site, that where it's coming from, then it's mainly actually coming from entering fermentation from the animals. It's one area which is very difficult to minimize. You can do something with food mixture, but it's very difficult to change in the future. Then the second biggest is the manure management, which is very sizable. Field emissions, where is also deducted the absorption of the CO2, fuels, fertilizer production. Purchased feeds is also very important. Everything what we buy in, for instance, energy feeds for the dairy cows. So our total emission from the milk production was 47 or near to 48,000 tons of CO2. And then we looked at international peers, that how we look in the international comparison. No, we can say that in the Baltic area, the averages are varying between 1.2 to 1.8 kilogram. There are several studies made in the past. Some of them are pretty old, and in the meantime, I think the efficiency of the agriculture production in the Baltic countries has actually quite much improved. But we consider that our result is, in comparison with the international peers in the Baltics and also in the European countries, it's actually quite good. And there is way to be done downwards, but actually we are pretty happy with our results. There are also some Nordic examples. For instance, Arla, the Danish giant of dairy business, has in 2017 had a group result 1.15 kilograms of CO2 emissions. Valio, which has also targeted carbon neutral milk production by 2035, they actually don't show their actual result anymore. They sometimes showed it, but even compared to the Valio historical levels, Agrones emissions for milk are pretty good. Then the grain production, our calculations showed that Agrones Group grain production footprint is 0.34 kilograms of CO2 for 1 ton of grain, 1 kilogram of grain. And if you look at the pile that where it's coming from, then it's mainly, of course, field emissions. And here we can also deduct the absorption of the CO2. Then there is a fuels, what we use on the fields when we go with our machinery. Very important in the grain production is fertilizer production and production. And it's also there in this article. It's very important, or very big difference comes that whether you are using the fertilizers which are coming from the CIS countries, or you are using the mineral fertilizers which are coming from European factories with a lower CO2 emissions. And here again, when we looked at international pairs, how our result looked like, then let's say for the European countries, it's mainly varying between 0.30 to 0.47 kilograms CO2. So Agrona's result 0.34 is actually quite good. And again, there is optimization to be done in order to get it even better. We also have egg production in Estonia in Agrona Group, and we actually thought so that that egg production footprint will be the biggest, and so it was. So whenever we buy eggs, then you must know that the eggs carbon emissions are quite sizable, and it's actually not so big difference whether you are kind of but the difference between keeping the eggs in different classification of the welfare, there are no big difference on the CO2 emissions actually. So in our case, our emissions were 2 kilograms and 2.55 kilograms for 1 kilogram of eggs. And when we look at the pile that how and where it's coming from, then in egg production, the biggest impact actually comes from purchased feed, which is mainly grain and also minerals. So it has the biggest bulk of the emissions. So whenever you get your purchased feed emissions lower, for instance, using some food from the humans which are not anymore eatable for the humans, then you get less emissions immediately. So and second biggest impact here is from manure and also purchased in chickens and electricity basically. So it's quite understandable and easy to understand where the emissions are coming from the egg production, and it's, I would say, also reasonably easy to change these emissions here. And internationally, again, when we look, there are different studies made in different countries in Europe and elsewhere. And when we look different methods of keeping the chickens, then in Netherlands there is made one assessment in 6 years ago where caged chickens had emission 2 kilograms and 230 grams, which is also the case in Agrona that we have caged chickens. So we are quite happy with our result, and when we compare also with Poland or other neighboring countries, then it's actually quite good emissions result for us. But of course there is improvement opportunities. So that was all from my side. For us, it was a first experience to map our carbon emissions, and definitely we will continue in the following years. And definitely you should have a good partner for it. You should make a good homework, and you should also have a stakeholder management done inside your company and also outside. So thank you.
Thank you, dear Silver. Really very interesting. I hear an echo. Is the sound okay? Yes, so thank you, dear Silver. Really interesting presentation. Never thought that eggs are so polluting, you could say, or emitting so big CO2 quantities, actually. I was also a little bit surprised, if I may use the opportunity to ask you, Silver, that your scope 1 was significantly bigger than scope 3 emissions, which maybe is specific for agro sector, because we usually see that actually scope 3 usually is a higher, let's say, part or share of total emissions. How you could comment?
I would say that if you looked our slides also, then it speaks for the dairy business, milk production. because in milk production you have a lot of emissions which are coming directly from the animals and related to the animal well-being. So yeah, if you look at the grain production, it's less in the scope 1. So it is, in general, I would say that agriculture is very scope 1 intensive area. So but it's one side positive that you can make changes yourself inside your house, but it's also quite challenging actually to make changes.
Good, thank you, Silver. So that was the last presentation, and as promised, we will have a brief Q&A session. So once again, I thank all the presenters for really insightful presentations. I don't see many of the questions in our comment section. We will continue in English, of course. I see that there is a question to most probably Giedrė, you can take it. What could be the fines or penalties established for the companies if not meeting of any regulation or any requirement set by regulation?
Well, it depends on the regulations that you should be compliant with. If we are talking about those regulations that I mentioned, so it will be Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Taxonomy Regulation. It hasn't actually set the fines. I haven't seen it in the draft acts. So most probably we will see locally those fines established, not on European Union level. So just check your local regulations when the time comes.
Okay. Anyone additionally has to add to this topic? Good. I believe, yes, this is still, let's say, setting the framework and the regulation. So definitely the more detail, including penalties, will come further. I guess this is, first of all, of course, what we need to establish the platform on which. I also see a question. I guess I can take it, actually. How the bank will assess the transitional investments, the transition investments. Will there be any financing conditions more comfortable or better to the ones both in terms of the structure and pricing? I should stress actually that of course it's still about the risk taking, and bank will still assess all the standard classical financing risks. So it will not be a miracle, of course, and the credit worthiness or analysis and assessment of the credit worthiness of any investment still will be performed by the bank. But I am really sure that the pressure from society, the need to change the business and to drive to more sustainable investments will automatically, result in a higher willingness by the bank to finance such kind of investments, which will create higher competition and which will definitely result in better conditions, somewhat better conditions. Maybe I should put a disclaimer here, both on pricing and on financing conditions. And if you check now with green loans conditions, this is a good example actually. But majority of green loan financing has a very, I would say, comfortable conditions, both on structure and on pricing. As these type of assets actually for the banks are very demanded. Banks will drive their portfolio footprint. So definitely green, sustainable financing definitely will be of very high interest for the banks. But of course, common sense, credit worthiness, risk-reward principles will still prevail. It will not be definitely that will go out of a common sense. And that's it actually what we have on the questions from the audience. So given and looking at the time that we already a little bit exceeded our set agenda. We apologize for that, but I think the presentations were really worth of listening to them for a little bit longer than we initially estimated. So once again, I would like to use the opportunity and thank all the presenters, dear Giedrė, dear Marko, dear Silver, dear Karl-Oskar, for being here with us and presenting your really very interesting messages and where the whole business society, where the whole corporate world will need to develop and transform towards a really sustainable future. I do hope that everyone from you who have listened to this presentation will take something for you, and this will be a nice starting point for you to start some new activities, some new thinking. And if that will happen, we will be super happy about that, as we will think that this webinar really has capitalized with some nice actions on your table. So with that, once again, I thank our dear guest. I thank all of you who have listened. And I hope you to have any other webinar on some different topic. So let's stay connected, and I wish you a nice Thursday. So thank you all. Bye.